start
I'm
recording.
quarantining.
Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking a little bit more about, like I said, the one true God, and we really can't. Once again, we're not going to be able to know who is the one true God unless God does something to initiate contact with humans, unless He does something to speak into our world. And of course, some people like the idea of God, creating the universe. Like he does the first thing, he creates the universe, and then that's kind of it. God's kind of done. So it's easier for some people, as I said before, just to believe in a creator. A lot of people believe in like a higher power, they believe in a first cause, which is, I mean, they're on the right track, they're at step one, but you've got to get to step two. And so sometimes when you talk to people, you have to get them to step one just to break them out of their agnosticism or atheism, just to get them to even believe in God, like let alone a creator, right? But the goal is not just to have them stop there. You could believe in all the arguments for design, that God designed the universe and God designed the earth and God designed human bodies and God did all this designing, but that doesn't get you all the way to the God of the Bible, right? So God's going to have to go further. And we know that if you believe in the first creation, I mean, the first miracle, which is creation, if God, at the begin, if he, if there was nothing and then he created something where time, space, and matter came into existence, we know that there's no, there's no natural explanation for that because there was no nature before the beginning of the universe. There were no natural laws. There was no science. There was nothing. So God brought everything into existence at a beginning point, and we know that cause outside the universe has to be supernatural, has to be non-natural. Okay. And so that's good. But like I said, you can't just stop there. But that would be the first miracle, the miracle of creation. And so if you believe that God, if you think God created the universe, that's the first miracle, then, as Lewis said, C.S. Lewis said, if you let alone if you say God exists, then obviously miracles are on the table because God's outside of the natural world. And if God exists, supernatural things are possible, non-natural events are possible. Now, that doesn't mean God can't use natural things. He's in charge of the natural world. He's behind the scenes of the natural world, and he uses the natural world for his purposes, right? But he can also inject into the world. Sometimes he'll intervene and do something very unique to get people's attention, because that's what miracles are. They're attention getters. They're supposed to get people to stop and say, "Whoa, God is doing something." Like that is something that is supposed to get our attention, that God's acting in history and he's trying to get people's attention, trying to show them who he is. And he has a very specific purpose behind the miracle he does. So when we ask if God has done something more than to communicate beyond just creating the world, we're asking, where has he intervened into human history? Where has he stepped in and revealed himself in a very personal way? If he has, where is he? Some people don't think he has. That's what deists believe. A deist is somebody who believes God just kind of created the universe, wound it up, got it going. He did. He is the first cause, but then after that, there's God's not doing a whole lot after that. He kind of steps away and kind of lets the creation take its course. But when we're talking about being theists, we're talking about, we believe that God's intervened into human history. And so, of course, you have the major world religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism. And there's only three monotheistic faiths, being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Um, the other ones don't even believe really in like a one God. They don't believe in a personal God. So, you can't really argue. I mean, you'd have to make a case that, um, Hinduism and Buddhism. First of all, Buddhism doesn't necessarily believe in God. You don't have to believe in God to be Buddhist. Um, and Hinduism believes in multiple gods. And New Age belief is kind of vague, as I said. It's just belief in some kind of higher power. Secular humanism is just atheism, so obviously that's off the table. And then Mormonism is polytheistic too. They believe man eventually becomes God. We become gods, right? And of course, Wicca is kind of like a secular issue, and Confucianism. But Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the ones that we need to look at to see if God has really revealed himself through a miracle. Okay, if he's done something unique in those three faiths. Um, Christopher Hitchens was a very famous atheist. He passed away from cancer, I think, about 6 years ago. Um, wrote a very famous book, How Religion, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And very, very staunch atheist, very vocal, did a lot of debates with Christians, very, very good at rhetoric, not great on substance. If you watch some of his debates, he doesn't do a great job on substance, but he's good on rhetoric. But he once made this comment, and it's kind of interesting. He said that since all these revelations, many of them hopelessly inconsistent, cannot be simultaneously true, it must follow that some of them are false and illusory. It could also follow that one of them is authentic, but in the first place, this seems dubious, and in the second place, it appears to necessitate religious war in order to decide whose revelation is the true one. So he's right that all the different revelations, as I showed on this chart here, all of them can't be true. Then they're all contradictory in some level. And obviously, some of them would be man made, meaning that they don't have an origin in God himself. Obviously, I don't think that Islam is from God or any God. I think that's man made. I think Hinduism is man-made. I think the secular humanism is man-made because there's no God in secular humanism. Mormonism, I don't think Joseph Smith received any vision from two angels, so I think that's man-made. So they all can't be true, and Hitchens is right. But the only problem is what he says is that back here he says that you have to have some sort of religious war to figure out which one's true. That's not necessarily true. All you do is evaluate the evidence for each one. You look at the claims that each religion makes and you ask, what's the evidence for it? How good is the evidence? And is it good? Is it better than the other one? Is there better evidence for this claim than the other one, right? So when it comes to defining miracles, Craig Keener once said, he does say this in his book, Miracles Today. He's a New Testament scholar. He says that there's no universally agreed on definition, but probably the most useful one with abundant historical warrant is a miracle of special divine action, although that definition may require something defining itself. So there's a lot of debates over how to define a miracle, what it is. There's been a lot of good books on miracles. Remember, miracles are really important because if miracles don't occur, then our faith would be false. So, because if there's no such thing as miracles, then the New Testament would be false. The Old Testament would be false too. But there's all kinds of books you can get on these topics, the topic of miracles. I recommend all these if you want to go deeper. And some people, no doubt about it, when they hear the word miracle, obviously, they think supernatural, right? Maybe some people might think it's, superstition, something like ghosts and fairies. That's all part of that under that definition, or weird things. Just weird things that happen, like, I mean, things in the Bible, are obviously supernatural. Some people, we don't see some of those things today. As far as like, we don't see people just being translated into the sky. We don't see partings of the Red Sea. We don't see people rising from the dead, then staying alive. We see people can get resuscitated and come back from the dead, but they die again. And so that's why, some people obviously have a hard time with the miraculous. Not everybody, a lot of people believe in the miraculous. It's not like there's a huge skepticism out there. Most people, I mean, look at all the fascination with the paranormal, all these movies that come out, all these television shows. People are fascinated with somewhat of some kind of supernatural realm. So we live in a day, though, where we're probably, as far as on a worldview level, if you look at the pre-modern worldview, which all of us believe in because we're all part of that worldview, God was the starting point of everything. God's the foundation of knowing anything. God is the starting point of knowledge, of rationality, of anything. So um, God's a creator and he's the foundation of everything. Then you move into the Enlightenment period, and then you kind of had a lot more emphasis on science and rationalism. You had neo-Darwinianism in that period, the writings of a lot of philosophers. So there was a lot of skepticism, during that phase, skepticism towards God. And then you moved on, you had like postmodernism kind of react to that. And then a lot of people today, a lot of people are definitely in all three of these categories. You can't really categorize just one person because some people we've all been impacted by all three, but certainly people can be part of any of, you've got people certainly postmodern today where they can just believe in mysticism or just believe in some sort of faith system that works for them. And so definitely, like I said, some people are a mix of all three. And so I just want to emphasize when you're talking to people that definitely people are impacted by all three of these worldviews. We all are, no doubt about it. But we are certainly still part of the pre-modern. I mean, no, we don't live in a pre-modern world, but people hold the pre-modern views, meaning that if you just believe God is the starting point of anything, you're pre-modern to a certain extent. But it's not that everything about the modern period is totally bad. It's not everything about postmodernism is totally wrong, but they certainly get some things wrong as well. They certainly are not if God's not the starting point, they're going to be off on a lot of things. In science, definitely, science can't really show the supernatural doesn't exist because science only studies the natural or material world. Okay, and so there's no doubt that science cannot say conclusively that God doesn't exist or there's no supernatural things. So when someone says to you, well, science has shown God doesn't exist, they have no idea what they're talking about because I just always ask them, well, what is science? Science only looks for natural material causes. And God transcends the natural world. By definition, God transcends the entire natural world. So I don't know how you would use science to prove God doesn't exist. Now, you certainly can use science to show God exists, like there's good scientific arguments for God, but depends on what kind of method you're using. But God certainly can use the natural world for his purposes. Okay. But you just want to challenge people on how they're defining science. If science already excludes the supernatural and won't allow any kind of causes that are non-natural, then there's no way it could really, it's already written God out before it even started. So that doesn't work. So there's no doubt that the miracles play a huge role in the Bible. They play a huge role in the life of Jesus. We know that there's all kinds of miracles in the Gospels. There's nature miracles where there's changes in the environment. You have Jesus walking on water, of course. You have him feeding the 5,000. You have him doing these supernatural things because he's a supernatural Jesus, right? So of course you're going to see supernatural things. Some people don't want a supernatural Jesus. They just want kind of like a natural Jesus. They want a Jesus who's a good ethical teacher who can help them when they have a need, that he's a good moral example. But they don't really want the full supernatural Jesus. I once had a student that said, I don't think it matters whether Jesus is the Son of God or whether he's really God, because all that matters is you learn how to live your life based on his ethical teachings. You follow his example. And I said, well, why is it you can't accept a supernatural Jesus? You know why? Because a supernatural Jesus makes a claim on your life. It means he takes ownership over your life and he requires things of you. So it's a lot easier just to believe in a non-supernatural Jesus, right? That's what a lot of people like today. Like, I love Jesus. He's a great example. He's so kind and compassionate and loving. He's a great example, but I just don't buy into those miracles. I don't buy into that stuff in the New Testament. Stuff's hard to believe. Yeah, because if that is really who Jesus is, he is the divine Son of God and he's a supernatural Jesus. And he requires you to give your life to him, right? Obviously, the ultimate miracle is the resurrection. If Jesus, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus not raised from the dead, then Jesus is a liar and Christianity is false, and we're all deluded, right? And so you can falsify Christianity today. You can do it if you can produce the body of Jesus. If you can find the body of Jesus, then that would show Christianity is false. Now, they tried to do that years ago in Israel. The director of the movie Titanic, James Cameron, the director of the Avatar movies, he had an archaeologist and they tried to find the tomb of Jesus. They found what are called ossuaries in Israel. Those are bone boxes of the remains of people from the first century, because the families, all the bones from each family, be buried in a family tomb together. That would be an ossuary, and they found a bunch of ossuary boxes in Israel, and so they thought if they could find the family of Jesus, that he'd be buried in there with his family, but they never found it. And they found a bunch of bone boxes with the name Yeshua on it, because Jesus' Hebrew name is Yeshua, and Yeshua is a very common name in first century Israel. And we know that obviously that if there's just multiple bone boxes with Yeshua on it, so there's no way to ever know if one of them was really the Yeshua, the Jesus. But obviously they never found it because Jesus is physically risen from the dead. So when God does something in history and he speaks into history, when he does these miracles, like I said, he's giving knowledge of himself, he's revealing himself, and he's looking for a response. Remember when Jesus did the miracles in front of the crowds, he was looking for faith and repentance. He was looking for them to respond correctly, not just to say, "Oh, Jesus, you're so great. You're a great miracle worker. Do another one for us. Entertain us." That is not why Jesus did the miracles. The response, when he did these, the response was supposed to be obedience. Okay. And of course, that happened with some of the people. Some people believed and they started to follow him, but others were like, well, we'll just go follow him around and maybe he'll come to our town and do some miracles here, or maybe he can do something else for us. They wanted what Jesus could give them, they didn't want him. Okay. And so supposed to be a response. Okay. And we also know in the Old Testament when God did miracles in front of Israel that sometimes it didn't really do anything. They fell right back into sin when God parted the Red Sea, and then they started to worship the golden calf when he delivered them out of Egypt. We know they fell right back into idolatry. So some people today think that God is responsible for giving them a miracle. He's supposed to show them he's real. He's supposed to do something personal for them. The Bible isn't enough for them, and they're deserving a miracle, but it doesn't always lead to faith. It doesn't always lead to repentance. Sometimes it just leads to more skepticism and more hardened hearts. So people should stop challenging God and trying to make God do something he's not required to do. I'll tell you a true story. A friend of mine that helps with our campus outreach, years ago, he was at Ohio State where we do our ministry, and he was under a tree talking to a hardcore atheist, and this atheist was mocking all the campus preaching and all the evangelism was going on. I guess there was a crowd there that day. I wasn't there. This was years and years ago. And apparently my friend was talking to him under a tree, this atheist, and this atheist said to my friend, he said, if God's real, he should strike me down with lightning right now. Bring lightning and show me you're real. Well, there was already a storm about to start. Within about 3 seconds, lightning hit the tree that this atheist was leaning up against, and the tree hit the tree, and the guy fell back onto the ground. He didn't get killed, but my friend had to take him I guess he had to walk him over to the medical center, and the guy was so shaken up he could barely talk. I don't know whether that guy ever became a Christian, but he tested God that day, and God apparently had had enough. But it just goes to show you that sometimes people want to do that, but they may end up not liking what they get in response. True story. I know it's true because he's a very good friend of mine, and I know he's telling the truth, by the way, about that. Um, okay. So if God exists, then obviously miracles are certainly possible. We know that a miracle is a special act of God for a very specific purpose. And we know that God is the source of truth. But we know that when God does miracles in the Bible, that he does them through a prophet. And we know that when he's doing something new in Israel's history, he raises up a prophet and he does the miracles through the prophet. Like, for example, Moses, when he raised up Moses to go tell Pharaoh to let Egypt go, to let the Jewish people go out of Egypt, we know that Moses didn't really know what to do. He said, I don't know if they're going to listen to me. And I'm not a great man of many words. I have a hard time speaking. I don't have the confidence. And God told Moses that he would do signs through him, that he would send him as his prophet. And he would do the signs through Moses. And that's how people would know he was sent by God. Of course, Moses does do those signs. You remember the story, the signs he does, the miracles. So God was doing something new and he needed he was confirming new revelation. And so he did it through a prophet. And then you see that through history, through the Bible, that God does these miracles in scattered periods. Like he does it in what we call the Mosaic period. He does, as I said, through Moses, and then he does it through a couple of the prophets, Elijah and Elisha. We know that, and then he doesn't do it through all the prophets. He does it. We call these sign prophets. These are prophets that did miracles specifically, and then he does it in the first century with the coming of Jesus. Jesus obviously is a prophet as well. He's more than a prophet, but he does miracles to confirm he's a true prophet of God. And he does all those miracles in the book of John, we know. And, he does these signs. Nicodemus says to him, I know you have to be from God because you do these signs, right, in John chapter 3. And then we see some of the apostles doing some of the miracles at the beginning of the apostolic period. But then that's pretty much it. I mean, we don't really need a new prophet today. God's spoken through Jesus, and the church has started. The early community got started. And God doesn't need to raise up a new prophet today because he already has given us all the revelation we need. That's why when people come along centuries later, like Muhammad or Joseph Smith or other ones, and people claim this is new revelation, it can't be new revelation because it contradicts the previous revelation, which is the final revelation through Jesus. Okay, and so there's no new prophets today doing new miracles. There's no need for that. Okay, whatever happens today can only confirm what's already written in the Bible. There's no new revelation, as I said before. God doesn't have anything new to communicate to us. Okay, he's communicated everything he wants us to know through the Bible. We just have to learn how to apply it into our lives. Okay, if he is still communicating new revelation, then that's why we have all the cults out there. Okay, that's why we have cults today. So let's compare a little bit, couple things about Islam and Judaism with miracles and Christianity. There's a couple good books on Islam if you want to read a little more on Islam. Um, Christians and Muslims we don't worship the same God. Yes, it's true. Muslims are monotheists, and they believe in a first cause like we do. They believe God is omnipotent, uncaused, ultimate. He's the creator of all things. We believe that. But it's not really quite the same thing that we believe because Muslims are what we call Unitarians, meaning that they believe in one God, um, but they're not Trinitarian. Okay, we believe in one God revealed in three persons. We believe God is one essence, but he's revealed in three persons. They just believe in one person, which is Allah, right? So technically, we don't worship the same God. Okay, I don't know why Christians say that sometimes. Like, we all worship the same God. That's just ignorance. So you obviously have not looked into Islam enough to make that claim. Um, It is true why Allah is the word Muslims use for God. Arabic speaking Christians can also use Allah in their Bible translations to refer to God. In Arabic, Allah is the word formed from the noun God and the attached definite article al. Thus, Allah could be translated English as the God. So you can do that, but it doesn't mean it's in as far as concept, it's the same God. Maybe you can, use that name, but it's not the same God. Like the God of the Bible and all are the same. Now, as I said, being the Muslims are Unitarian, they don't believe in the Trinity. They don't believe Jesus is God, and they believe ascribing any partner to Allah, that Allah has any helpers or partners, is to commit the sin of shirk. That means blasphemy. Okay, and so that's why they reject God having a son. They reject Jesus as a deity. They think that that's shirk or blasphemy. So the God of Islam is undivided and singular. He is a completely other creator and judge to whom humanity owes worship and submission. The result of such otherness is that God himself is unknowable in any intimate relational sense. So in Islam, definitely God is not a father like he is in Christianity and in Judaism. He's so distant from us and he requires submission. It's a totally different view of God. He's not an intimate father. Now, the way that the revelations were received by Muhammad are varied. Some say that Muhammad received, and by the way, I bring up the Quran because Muslims think the Quran is a miracle. The giving of the Quran is really it's almost really worshipped by Muslims in a way, more than like Christians don't worship the Bible. We have reverence for it. We think it's authoritative. It's the inspired word of God. We don't really worship it. But Muslims have a much kind of a different view of the Quran. But supposedly Muhammad received these revelations through the angel Gabriel. And Muhammad was confused about what was going on. He had to go talk to his wife. He felt like he was choking, had some physical issues, but he was kind of confused about these supposed revelations in the cave, this cave he had. He was out by himself. And so Muhammad was certainly a case of somebody that had a private angelic encounter about God. It was by himself. It wasn't publicly witnessed. He was all alone. Now, of course, he went out, he told people afterwards, and he recited supposedly what Allah gave to him to recite verbally. That's a lot to recite, but he was all by himself. It's a little different from Christianity. It's way different because Jesus appeared publicly to many, many, many people. Okay, it wasn't like a private event. Now, Paul certainly had his own experience, but everything happened to him was verified by the other apostles because they'd also seen the risen Jesus. So this was much more of a public event. Jesus appeared to many groups. It wasn't just like one person Jesus appeared to and then Christianity got started, right? So it's very different from Islam. Now, one thing that the Quran does do, which means it can't be a miracle from God, is it denies the crucifixion of Jesus. As I've said before, they don't believe that it was actually Jesus on a cross. They believe that Allah would allow no prophet of his to be killed. And so they believe the disciples thought it was Jesus, but Allah deceived them and made it look like Jesus, but it wasn't really Jesus. It was it was one of Jesus's disciples or somebody else that Allah used as like a counterfeit. It looked like they thought it was Jesus, wasn't really Jesus. So they, as it says here, Allah made someone resemble Jesus. But what Allah really did is he took Jesus up into heaven, and that the person on the cross wasn't really Jesus. So Allah delivered his prophet and put someone else there that made it look like Jesus. So Allah is a deceiver. But they believe that Jesus was not physical. Now, I'd say most Muslims don't believe Jesus was crucified. There are some Muslims that don't agree with that, but most of them don't think Jesus was crucified. Um, some Muslims believe, some very, very strange, I should say a very fringe view thinks that Jesus was alive. Some agree that Jesus, like another view is that Jesus escaped the crucifixion and he was taken alive in his body to heaven. Oh, that's right. That's the same thing I was just saying. Yeah. That Allah took him, he wasn't really crucified, Allah took him to heaven and return in the future. But Allah certainly would allow one of his prophets to be crucified. That goes against what Allah would do. Um, now, um, obviously, like I've said before, the Quran was written 600 to 650 years after the time of Jesus, whereas the crucifixion of Jesus is recorded all throughout the New Testament. That's first century eyewitness evidence. And so it's very hard to believe a book that's written that came along 650 years later after Jesus is more trustworthy than the first century eyewitness evidence. But if you talk to Muslims, like I have, they don't seem to care about this. They don't care about historical dating. They think the Quran is perfect. They think it's absolutely the perfect word of God, the perfect revelation of Allah. And even if it was written 650 years later after the New Testament, they don't care. Obviously, I think that's absolutely insanity. Anybody that knows anything about history knows that the earlier records are better. And to believe a guy that can come along like Muhammad in 600 to 650 AD, a guy that didn't even know Jesus, didn't know any of the apostles, didn't know anything about the first century, suddenly can have some supposed revelation which became a written text that says Jesus was never crucified is ridiculous. It's just so late, and we know that the later is real. The late day, that's so late. If it was like a couple centuries, that'd still be too late. Even a century later, be too late. But 6 centuries later, that's way too late to tell me anything about Jesus's crucifixion. Now, because you have, if that's true that Jesus was never crucified, then that would mean that all these first century and second century documents that recorded Jesus's crucifixion were all false. That means they all thought that Jesus was crucified, but he really wasn't crucified. They were deceived. And then Muhammad comes along in the 6th century and corrects them, corrects all these people from the first and second century that they got it all wrong. And Muhammad figured it out. Muhammad revealed that 6 centuries later that all these documents you had written at the time of Jesus and even towards the second century were all false. Okay. So that it's just very, very hard to believe that. Obviously, anybody with any common sense about how history works. Now, we know that there's multiple eyewitnesses to Jesus's crucifixion in the New Testament. I don't need to read all these passages, but they're all over the place. Eyewitnesses to the crucifixion. Um, we know that there's also non-biblical sources that speak about Jesus's crucifixion. People outside the New Testament, some of these are stronger than others, but there's so much evidence Jesus was crucified that it's just unbelievable that Muslims would still hold to that, but they do because they are deeply deceived, sadly. Of course, we know that in the Old Testament, the Messiah, it predicts the Messiah would die. Daniel and Isaiah, Psalm 22, Zechariah 12:10. There's plenty of passages in the New Testament, of course, to say that Jesus was crucified. So you read the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah being crucified. Now, what about miracles and like other religions? Like, what if somebody in another faith has something happen to them that be considered a miracle? We know that God does things in the Bible to people that are not Jews. He heals Naaman, the Syrian, of leprosy, right? We know that Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, sorry, I have Acts 9 on this slide. I don't know why I did that, but we know that Cornelius receives an angelic vision, right, about that whole thing about Peter's coming to witness to him. Yeah, I'm not opposed to saying God cannot do miracles in other people of other faiths. Um, God could use that to get them um, prepared for the gospel. Maybe he does something and he's going to send someone into their lives that will witness to them with the gospel at a later date. Um, but no, we wouldn't want to say that it's impossible for God certainly to do something in another faith, like he does something like a miraculous event. I wouldn't say it's not possible. All we need to do though is just know what is the miracle that you're hearing about? What is the claim? What's the historical and religious context of that miracle, and what's the evidence for it, right? What is the evidence for it? Like what when someone says to me, well, this religion has this miracle in it, and I say, okay, well, when did that happen? What's the evidence for it? What's the claim? Were there any eyewitnesses? And I'm just going to evaluate the evidence for it. That's what you do in any miracle claim, right? Now, when Craig Keener wrote his book, um, these came out a ways back, I think like maybe 12, 13 years ago. I'm trying to remember, maybe 10 years ago. He wrote a book called Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts. He wrote a 2-volume set. He did this documentation of all the miracle reports across the world today. And he had all kinds of documentation of miracles happening all across the world. Definitely in other parts of the country, certain countries, obviously, maybe more than others. But he documents all those in those books. So God is still doing supernatural things. God is acting, right? He's doing things. It's not just like, well, he did all those things in the Bible and he's kind of done. My dad used to say to me, he would say, I don't understand why God doesn't do these things today. That was so long ago. He parted the Red Sea or he raised Jesus from the dead. Why doesn't he do something today? Well, he's doing things. He is doing miraculous things. We just don't hear about him all the time. And sometimes, we need to talk to missionaries that are in different parts of the world because we get very confined in our own little circles in the United States. But, we need to think globally. And God is acting in other countries. He's doing other things or doing things there. So I encourage you to maybe read some of the things Keener talks about because he has some really good documented things in that book. I think perhaps in the West, in the United States, we're a little, I mean, the West covers more of the United States, but I think that obviously we may be a little more skeptical in the United States of some of these things, but in other countries, they're very open to the miraculous. Now, obviously, you have to take that with a grain of salt. You have to be careful and discerning, but Keener talks about all kinds of things that have happened in other countries all over the place. Now, if you ever talk to Muslims, we actually have a Muslim group on campus that is doing this event, I think next week, talking about scientific miracles of the Quran. A lot of times they like to point out scientific miracles of the Quran. A lot of them have been responded to, and they're all ridiculous. But one of them, I'll just mention of 3 or 4 of these. One thing they'll say is that the Quran describes a fertilization process and embryonic growth before it was known about this. Like it spoke about it before any scientist knew about that. That's not true. You can read about people way before the Quran was written, such as Aristotle and others, who described all these things long before the Quran was written. So I don't know why someone would think a 6th century book speaks of something that no one knew about before that, when it's like the 6th century. There's plenty of people around way before the Quran. There's another one where the Quran says that iron was being sent down to the heavens before it was known. The meteors containing iron fell to the earth from outer space. And there's a passage in the Quran that says And we sent down iron in which there lies great force, in which many uses are for mankind. Um, Pretty problematic. Um, Obviously, it was common knowledge before the Quran was written that meteors containing iron fell to the earth from space. Even the Egyptians spoke about this. So I'm not sure why that is really considered a miracle. People knew about meteors long before the Quran was written. And then we have another one. The Quran describes the moon's light as reflected light long before it was known. It says in Surah 71:16, he made the moon his light in their midst and made the sun his lamp. And he placed therein a lamp and a moon giving light. So the claim is that these words, Nur and Munir, mean reflected light. This is wrong again, um, because obviously, once again, it's not that uh, people didn't know anything about this before the Quran was written. Even if you were accept the meaning they gave, it was already known the moon's light was reflected light 1,000 years before Muhammad. Aristotle even described a lunar eclipse that makes this very clear because Aristotle existed long before the Quran. One of the weirdest ones is the claim that Muhammad split the moon. I don't know if you ever heard this. They believe that the moon had a crack in it. Um, and they think that it was a sign given. Now, they don't believe Muhammad literally split it. They believe that the Allah did it. But they say Muhammad talked about it, and it's mentioned in one passage in the Quran. It says the hour is drawn near and the moon is split. Yeah, whenever they see a miracle, they turn and say continuous magic. So basically, Muhammad's saying that there's a miracle from Allah that the moon split, but people won't believe it. It's the part of the problem is also that the splitting of the moons recorded in the hadiths, which are the oral traditions about Muhammad, which came about 200 years after Muhammad died. Um, so back here, like I said, this doesn't say Muhammad split the moon. Um, it's talking something about Allah, but it's so vague. And then they try to use the hadiths, which come way after Muhammad, to prove this, because most of the miracles of anything about Muhammad are in the hadiths, but they're 200 years after Muhammad. 200 years later, we have all of Jesus's miracles recorded within a 30 to 50-year gap of his life. These come 200 years later. So that's a problem as well. And also in NASA, I don't, from what I understand, my own research, NASA has never confirmed any kind of crack in the moon. From what I studied on this, there's never any confirmation of any splitting or crack in the moon scientifically. What about miracles in Judaism? Well, obviously, Christianity can confirm all the miracles of the Old Testament. We don't disagree about that. But the problem is, Jews today, sadly, don't believe in a lot of the miracles of the Old Testament because you don't have to believe in God to be Jewish. So many Jews reject the supernatural. They don't even believe in God, even though they're culturally Jewish. So I would say that most of them don't even believe that God parted the Red Sea or believe that he delivered them out of Egypt supernaturally or believe in some of the supernatural events in the Old Testament. They don't even believe it because they don't believe in God. Even there was a Pew survey in 2020 that said about Jewish Americans, that says overall about a quarter of U.S. Jewish adults do not identify with the Jewish religion. They consider themselves to be Jewish ethnically. Culturally or by family background, have a Jewish parent or raised Jewish, but they answer a question about their current religion by describing themselves as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular rather than as Jewish. Among Jewish adults under 30, 4 in 10 describe themselves this way. So a lot of Jews just don't believe in God. So obviously they're going to reject a lot of the miracles of the Old Testament. But most Jews I mean, the general traditional view of God, certainly, Christians and Jews agree God is eternal, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, omniscient, all present, and only one God exists. But once again, they're Unitarian. They don't accept the Trinity. And we know that Orthodox Jews today, there's ones in Israel right there. I've been to that exact same spot. Um, we know that a lot of them have been impacted by a guy named Maimonides, who is a very famous Jewish philosopher, theologian around the medieval period. And he reacted to Christianity and said that God can't take on any human form. Therefore, he rejected Jesus, of course, as God. And he made God as being very impersonal, that God is very distant and transcendent. But a lot of Jews follow the 13 principles of the Jewish faith given by Maimonides. He has these 13 principles, and you can read these online, but they certainly reject any kind of man as God. Now, obviously, the if you look at Ben Shapiro, who's a Orthodox Jew, he even says here why he rejects Jesus as a Messiah. He says Judaism never posited there would be a God coming to earth in physical form, then acting out in the world in that way. Judaism posits that God is beyond space and time. Occasionally intervenes in history, but he doesn't take physical form. It's one of the key beliefs of Judaism, actually an incorporeal God. The idea is actually foreign to Judaism, a merged God-man who is in God, physical form, who then dies, is resurrected, and all that is. It's just a different idea that exists in Judaism. He said that in an interview with Michael Shermer. So a lot of Jews obviously reject the supreme miracle of Christianity, which is Jesus and his death and resurrection, and the fact that he's God incarnate. Now, there is a guy named Benjamin Sommer who is an Orthodox Jewish scholar, but he doesn't believe in Jesus. But he wrote a book called The Bodies of God in the World of Ancient Israel. And in the book, he says that the Old Testament does show evidence of a Trinity. There is an idea in the old ancient Near East of a Trinitarian idea of God. So it's interesting that even though he doesn't believe in Jesus, he definitely thinks that the Old Testament does speak to some kind of Trinitarian view of God. Now, as far as like us worshiping the same God, Jews and Christians, we do worship the same God in some sense, but we could say the Jews have a incomplete understanding of who God is because they've rejected Jesus, most of them, not all of them, because obviously you have Messianic Jews today. But they obviously don't get the full God. They have like part of it, but they don't get the full understanding. So you could say, in one sense, we do worship the God of the Old Testament. But of course, then you have Rabbinic Judaism and their view of God, which kind of takes parts of the God from the Old Testament, but it's kind of, they add some things there as well onto it. But we certainly believe that they have an incomplete view of God. Whereas I would say with Islam and Christianity, I would say that Allah is just like a false God, period. So I don't think Allah is, I think that's a man-made God. So whereas in Judaism, I don't believe that's a man-made God. I just think it's incomplete because they haven't come to embrace Jesus. So they don't have that fuller understanding. Yeah, as I say here, generally speaking, the Christian does not reject the Jewish concept of God as a Muslim rejects the Christian concept of God, but the Christian faith finds the same God of the Old Testament more fully revealed in the New Testament, looks for anticipations of the Son, the Spirit in the Old Testament. But by contrast, the Muslim explicitly repudiates the concept of God found in the New Testament. That's right. Now, in Christianity, of course, and in Messianic Judaism, Jesus is God and man, the second person of the Trinity. In Judaism, Jesus is simply regarded maybe as a rabbi, teacher, prophet, maybe even a false prophet, or one of many failed messianic figures. And then in Islam, he's just a prophet. But we know that people can be sincerely seeking, could be sincere of their view of God. I think Muslims are sincere in their view of God. I think many people in many religions are sincere, but sincerity isn't a test for truth. Okay, because obviously you can be sincerely wrong. But I believe that if somebody already believes in God, and they've made that effort, they believe in some sort of creator, then if they're really seeking, God certainly can give them a fuller understanding of who He is by sending a messenger to them and sharing the gospel. That's the predominant way primary way He reaches people, right? So that's why we see people out there that have little, you're talking to people evangelistically. It's like helping them put the pieces of the puzzle together. They have little pieces, right? And they have little pieces about God, little pieces they've heard about the Bible, little pieces about Jesus, but they haven't put it all together. And so we do is we come along and we help them to try to put it all together, right? To have a complete puzzle. The puzzle is complete. And so that's why we want to be ready to share our faith and be ready to share the good news, because that's what we do, try to help people put it together. Um, so the ultimate miracle, I haven't gone over evidence for the resurrection yet. I'll do that another call. But Jesus, of course, God has revealed himself in history through the person of Jesus and through the nation of Israel. He has spoken in history through miracles, certainly. And we believe he's intervened through the nation of Israel when he raised that nation up. And there's plenty of evidence that, archaeologically speaking, that things in the Bible about the history of Israel and its relationship with God is verified through archaeology. But then we believe, of course, that Jesus is the ultimate revelation from God, and that's God's ultimate miracles through Jesus. And we believe there's better evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than other miracles. There's much better evidence for Jesus, his entire life and his everything he did, better evidence than in any other religion. So if people want to know what God is really like, they can't just believe in a creator. They're going to have to deal with Jesus. Who is Jesus? Said, I'm the only way to God. He said, if you see me, you've seen the Father. He's a full revelation of God. So that's why we want to get people to wrestle with who Jesus is, not just believe in God. Okay. Like I said, you can give people arguments for God using design arguments, using cosmological arguments, using moral arguments, but that won't get people all the way to the God of the Bible. I once saw a debate between a famous Christian apologist and an atheist to high estate, and the atheist at the end said, "Well, you didn't prove that this is the God of Christianity," and the Christian apologist said, "You must have missed the title of our debate tonight. The title was Does God Exist?" The title wasn't Does the God of Christianity exist? The title was Does God Exist? And what the Christian apologist did is he just gave 7 arguments for the existence of God. Instead of believing in atheism, he gave 7 arguments. And he did not establish all the way that it was the God of Christianity, because that wasn't the goal of the debate. You wouldn't establish the God of the Bible unless you get into history and examine the Bible's claims, right? That's when you would really establish what that God is really like and his character and what he has for humanity, right? So anyway, so that's about all I have, and we shall stop there and talk about anything you want.